think you know which countries have the biggest economies. You might actually be surprised. Welcome back to Marginal Thoughts. We're the place where we try to, unpack the big ideas shaping our world. And today, we're getting into something pretty fundamental for understanding global economics. Gross domestic product, GDP.
That's right. Yeah, GDP is a term you hear thrown around constantly, isn't it? And while it might sound complex, it's basically the main yardstick we use to measure a country's economic health. Understanding it really helps make sense of the news, global trends, even where different countries stand economically. So, yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, so for anyone listening who's maybe new to this, what exactly is GDP? Let's start right at the beginning.
Okay, so in its simplest form, GDP is the total value, the monetary value of all the finished goods and services produced within a country's borders over a specific time, usually a year. Think of it like adding up the price tag on everything a country makes, from, cars and computers to haircuts and banking services, all made inside that country.
Okay, let's break down the name itself. Gross.
Gross just means the total amount, before anything's taken out or deducted.
Right, and domestic.
Domestic means it happens within the country's geographical borders. That's key.
Okay, and product?
Product covers all the tangible things, the goods like food or clothes, and also the intangible services like teaching or healthcare, all that stuff.
Goods and services made inside the country's borders. Got it. Now, I remember hearing something about not counting everything. Like, you don't count the ingredients that go into making, say, bread.
Exactly, yeah. That's a really important point. To avoid double counting, we only look at the value of the final goods and services. So imagine a bakery. The GDP includes the value of the bread and cakes they sell to customers. But the flour, sugar, eggs they bought to make the bread, those aren't counted separately in GDP because their value is already baked into the price of the final loaf, right?
Okay, that makes sense. Just the finished product. But what if a country mainly produces raw materials? Like they just mine copper and sell that?
That's a great question. If those raw materials are basically the final product for that country, maybe they don't have the factories to process it further, then yes, the value of that copper they sell is counted in their GDP. Think about the bakery again. If they only sold bags of flour, well, then the value of the flour would be their contribution to GDP. But generally, processed goods, like the bread, sell for more than the raw ingredients, like the flour. So a country focusing only on raw materials might, find its GDP is lower than one that manufactures finished products.
Interesting difference. And what about the companies doing the producing? Does it matter if, say, an American company has a factory in the UK? Whose GDP does that count towards?
Good one. For GDP, it's all about location, not ownership. So if that American-owned factory is physically in the UK and producing things there, the value of what it produces counts towards the UK's GDP, not the US's.
Okay, location, location, location. Got it. So that gives us a good idea of what GDP is. But how on earth do economists actually figure this out, calculate it? It sounds like a massive job.
Oh, it is. It's a huge undertaking. But there are basically three main ways to calculate it. And the cool thing is, in theory, they should all give you the same number. For beginners, I think the easiest one to understand is probably the spending method or the expenditure approach.
The spending method. Okay, tell me more about that one.
Right. So the spending method adds up all the money spent on those final goods and services within the economy. It breaks it down into four main chunks. You often see it as a formula, GDP plus I plus G plus NX. This formula basically shows us who's doing the spending in the economy.
Okay, a formula. Let's decode it. C plus I plus G plus NX. What's C?
C is for consumption. This is basically everyday spending by people like you and me households. So buying groceries, clothes, movie tickets, paying rent, all that personal spending goes into the C part. It's usually the biggest chunk of GDP in most developed economies.
Okay, consumer spending. Got it. And I. Is that income?
Close, but I actually stands for investment. But it's not stocks and bonds investment. In GDP terms, I is mostly about businesses spending money. Think of a company buying new machinery, building a new factory, or even changes in their inventories, the stuff they have on shelves. And interestingly, when you buy a newly built house, that purchase also counts under I, investment.
Oh, okay. Business spending and new houses.
Right.
G must be government then.
You got it. G is government spending. This covers all the money spent by the government, federal, state, local, on goods and services. So things like building roads, bridges, paying for schools, the military, salaries of government workers. All that's in G.
Makes sense. And the last one, NX. What's that?
NX stands for net exports. It's a little different because it involves other countries. It's the value of a country's exports, stuff sold to other countries, minus the value of its imports, stuff bought from other countries. Exports add to your GDP because it's production happening here. Imports subtract because that spending is leaving the country for goods made elsewhere. Ideally, you want exports to be higher than imports, right?
Yeah.
So NX is positive.
So exports minus imports. Okay. So C plus I plus G plus NX adds up all the spending. You said there were other ways to calculate it too.
Yeah, briefly, there's the production approach, which looks at the value added at each stage of making something like the value the baker adds to the flour to make bread. And there's the income approach, which sums up all the incomes earned from that production: wages, profits, rents, interest. Like with our bakery example, spending looks at the $3 someone pays for the loaf. Production looks at the value added by the farmer, the miller, the baker. Income looks at the wages paid, the profit made. Should all come out to $3 GDP for that loaf.
Okay. Fascinating that they should all match up. So we know what it is, how it's measured, but I've definitely heard people talk about nominal GDP and real GDP. What's the difference there? This seems important.
It is really important. The difference boils down to one word: inflation.
Yeah.
You know, how prices tend to go up over time. Let's go back to our bakery. Say in 2024, they make 10 loaves of bread and sell them for $3 each. The contribution to nominal GDP is 10 times $3, so $30.
Okay. $30 nominal GDP in 2024.
Right. Now, let's say in 2025, they still only make 10 loaves of bread, same amount of actual bread. But because of inflation, the price has gone up to $4 a loaf. Now, the nominal GDP calculation for 2025 would be 10 times $4, which is $40.
Ah, so the nominal GDP number went up from $30 to $40, but they didn't actually produce any more bread. That feels kind of misleading if you want to know if the economy actually grew.
Exactly. That's the problem with nominal GDP. It's calculated using the prices that exist in that year. So it can go up just because prices went up, even if the actual amount of stuff being produced, the real output, stayed the same or even fell.
So how does real GDP fix that?
Real GDP adjusts for those price changes, for inflation. What economists do is they pick a base year and use the prices from that year to calculate the value of goods and services for all the other years. So if we pick 2024 as our base year, the price of bread is $3. When we calculate real GDP for 2025, even though the bread sold for $4, we'd still use the $3 base year price. So the real GDP for 2025 would be 10 loaves times the $3 base year price, which equals $30, just like 2024.
Ah, okay. So comparing the real GDP figures, $30 in 2024 and $30 in 2025, shows that there was no real growth in bread production. It strips out the effect of rising prices.
Precisely. Real GDP gives you a much more accurate picture of whether the economy is actually producing more or less stuff over time. It's the number economists and policymakers focus on when they talk about economic growth or recession.
That makes so much more sense. So when news reports say the economy grew by, say, 2%, they're almost always talking about real GDP growth, yeah.
Almost always, yes. That's the standard measure. Now, speaking of comparisons, what about comparing the GDPs of different countries? Just looking at the total real GDP number can be tricky too, can it?
Right, because you could have a huge country like China or India with a massive total GDP just because they have so many people, but that doesn't necessarily mean the average person is well off compared to, say, a smaller, richer country.
Exactly. Comparing total GDP doesn't account for population size. And it also doesn't account for the fact that prices for the same things can be wildly different in different countries. $1 might buy you a lot more in Mumbai than it does in New York.
Okay, so how do we make better comparisons?
Well, there are two main tools for that. The first is GDP at purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Purchasing power parity sounds like it tries to balance out those price differences.
That's exactly what it does. PPP tries to figure out how much money you need in different countries to buy the same basket of goods and services. Let's say that loaf of bread costs $3 in the US, but the equivalent loaf costs 100 rupees in India. If the market exchange rate is, say, $1 equals 100 rupees, then nominally they look the same value. But maybe $3 buys you a lot less other stuff in the US than 100 rupees buys you in India. PPP tries to adjust the exchange rate based on the actual buying power of the currency in its home country. So maybe the PPP adjustment says that in terms of actual stuff you can buy, $1 is only equivalent to, say, 33 rupees. So that 100 rupee loaf in India is actually worth $3 in PPP terms. making India's economy look bigger in real terms than the nominal exchange rate suggests.
Okay, so PPP adjusts for the cost of living, essentially, to give a fairer comparison of the actual economic output or size.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It helps compare the volume of production and potential living standards more accurately.
And the second tool you mentioned?
That's GDP per capita. This one's more straightforward. You just take the country's total GDP, often the PPP adjusted one for better comparisons, and divide it by the number of people living there.
So GDP per person.
Exactly. Per person. So think about, say, Indonesia and Singapore. Indonesia has a much, much larger total GDP than Singapore simply because it has a huge population.
Right.
But Singapore has a vastly higher GDP per capita. Dividing the total GDP by their smaller population shows that the average economic output per person is much higher in Singapore.
And that usually suggests a higher average standard of living, although maybe not always perfectly.
Generally, yes. A higher GDP per capita often correlates with better living standards, access to healthcare, education, etc. But it's crucial to remember it's just an average. It tells you nothing about how that income or wealth is distributed. You could have a country with a high GDP per capita due to oil wealth, but most of it is held by a tiny elite, and many people are still poor. It's not the same as average salary.
That's a really important caveat. Averages can hide a lot. Okay, so GDP, whether total, real, per capita, or PPP adjusted, seems super useful. But are there downsides, things it just misses?
Oh, definitely. GDP is powerful, but it's far from a perfect measure of everything we care about. There are quite a few limitations.
Like what?
Well, for starters, it doesn't count a lot of valuable work that isn't paid for in the market. Think about volunteer work or childcare and housework done within the family. That's incredibly valuable to society, but it doesn't show up in GDP numbers.
Right, the non-market stuff.
Exactly. Also, the informal or shadow economy, cash-in-hand jobs, unreported business activity, even illegal activities, these often aren't fully captured, especially in developing countries, which can make their GDP look lower than the reality on the ground.
Okay, what else?
It doesn't tell us anything about how the economic pie is sliced up, the distribution of wealth we mentioned. A high GDP could mask huge inequalities. And a big one, it doesn't account for negative side effects or externalities. If a factory pollutes a river while making widgets, GDP goes up because of the widgets, but the environmental damage isn't subtracted.
That seems like a major blind spot.
It can be. GDP also doesn't value leisure time. If everyone worked 80 hours a week, GDP might soar, but would quality of life improve? Probably not. And weirdly, GDP can actually increase after a natural disaster because of all the rebuilding activity, even though the disaster itself was obviously destructive.
Wow, okay, so it really is focused just on the monetary value of production and spending, not necessarily well-being or sustainability.
That's the crux of it. It's a measure of economic activity, not necessarily overall societal progress or happiness. And some argue it struggles to capture the value in modern digital and service economies compared to old-school manufacturing.
That's a lot to keep in mind. It's useful, but with big asterisks. So, flipping it around, if a country, especially maybe a lower-income one, wants to increase its GDP in a sustainable way, what are the basic strategies?
Well, there's no single magic bullet, obviously, but some common strategies focus on building productive capacity. For many developing countries, attracting foreign direct investment, or FDI, is often a key starting point.
Bringing in money from overseas companies?
Exactly. FDI brings not just money, but often technology, skills, access to international markets. It can create jobs, boost production, and generate tax revenue for the government.
Okay, but you probably don't want to rely only on foreign companies forever.
Absolutely not. Alongside attracting FDI, it's crucial to invest heavily in education and skills training for the local population. A better educated, more skilled workforce is more productive, more innovative, and can adapt to new technologies. The goal is often to help local businesses learn from those foreign companies, improve their own capabilities, and eventually grow strong enough to compete, maybe even replace the foreign firms in some areas.
So learn from outsiders, build up your own people and companies.
That's the long-term play. You see this pattern in countries that have made big economic leaps. Think post-war, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, China, and maybe Vietnam more recently. They often combined attracting foreign know-how with intense domestic investment in education and local industry support.
That makes sense. It's a long game. Now, something that I think confuses people sometimes, myself included, is the difference between a country's GDP and, like, the government's budget. They're not the same thing, are they?
No, definitely not. That's a really common misconception, but it's important to get clear. They are related, but distinct. Remember, GDP is the total value of everything produced by everyone in the country, individuals, businesses, government included within its borders in a year. It's the size of the whole economic pie.
Okay, the whole pie. So what's the government's revenue then?
The government's revenue is primarily the money it collects through taxes. Income tax, corporate tax, sales tax, like VAT, property tax. That's how the government gets its funding. That tax revenue is usually only a percentage of the total GDP. Think of it like the government taking a slice of that big economic pie to pay for public services like roads, schools, healthcare, defense, etc.
Ah, okay. The pie analogy helps a lot. GDP is the whole pie created by everyone, and government revenue is just the slice the government takes through taxes.
Exactly. So a bigger GDP, a bigger pie, generally means the government can potentially collect more taxes, a bigger slice, or the same percentage slice of a bigger pie, to fund its activities. But GDP itself isn't the government's bank account.
Right, that clarifies things nicely. We've covered a lot, from the basics of what GDP is, how it's measured, the nominal versus real distinction, comparing countries.
The pros and cons, how countries try to grow it, and how it differs from government money.
Yeah. But maybe we should just quickly revisit some of those limitations, because they seem really important for understanding what GDP doesn't tell us.
Definitely worth reiterating. It's a macroeconomic number, right? So if GDP drops 2%, it doesn't mean your personal lifestyle necessarily gets 2% worse overnight. It's broader than individual experience. And remember what it technically counts. Consumption, investment, government spending, net exports, that's the spending side. Measuring actual output directly is harder, which is why spending is often used as a proxy.
And the tricky bit about only counting final goods, not intermediate ones.
Right. The table counts, but not the wood, screws, and paint separately. But where do you draw the line? If you buy a new engine for your old car, is that a final product investment or just a repair? Intermediate. It can get blurry.
And the whole informal economy thing seems huge in some places.
It really is. Street vendors, unreported small businesses, under-the-table work. In many developing nations, this informal sector is massive, but largely invisible to official GDP stats, making those economies seem smaller than they might actually be. Even illegal activities, which technically should be estimated and included in GDP by some standards, are often missed.
And the foreign company aspect, again, GDP counts production here, even if profits go abroad.
Correct. That foreign car factory in the U.S. adds to U.S. GDP, even if the profits go back to Japan. Conversely, if an American company like Apple makes profits from sales in Europe, those profits don't count towards U.S. GDP, though they might count towards a related measure called GNP, Gross National Product, which focuses on ownership, but that has its own issues.
So GNP is about ownership, GDP is about location.
Basically, yes. GNP includes income earned by residents from overseas investments and subtracts income earned by foreigners in the domestic economy. But it can be volatile due to exchange rates and depends on the health of other economies. GDP is generally seen as a better measure of domestic economic activity.
And the assumption that more production is always better.
Yet GDP doesn't care about waste or sustainability. A country making cheap, disposable goods might have the same GDP as one making durable, long-lasting goods, but the second country is arguably building more long-term wealth. Think of Qatar with its massive GDP per capita from oil gas versus Japan with a lower GDP per capita, but arguably higher average net worth per person due to accumulated assets and different economic structures. High GDP doesn't automatically equal high wealth or well-being.
So the big takeaway seems to be GDP is incredibly important. It's the headline number for economic size and growth.
But it's definitely not the whole story. You need to look deeper and consider other factors to really understand a country's economic health and the well-being of its people.
Absolutely. It's a vital tool, but one we need to use with awareness of its limitations. This has been super helpful. Thank you. I feel like I have a much better handle on GDP now. So for everyone listening, what are your thoughts? Does GDP capture what you think is most important about an economy? Are there other things we should be measuring? Let us know down in the comments. And of course, if you found this useful and want more accessible explanations of important concepts that shape our world, please do subscribe to Marginal Thoughts. We'd love to have you back. Thanks for tuning in.